It seems that music has always been around. It wasn't invented any more than was fire and water. Music and Its Place in History is a series in 14 episodes. Its aim is to be a primer, or an overview, of music throughout history, offering an infinite number of triggers that could inspire more research and study. In the last episode, we followed the path of Western music repertoire into the fractured artistic scene of the 20th century. In this episode, we'll explore the rifts and fissures that were occurring to such an extent that the idea of a mainstream became rather meaningless. By 1920, it was evident that the idea of a common practice was falling away in favor of individualism and diversification. Artists who were innovators, influencers, and experimenters fed the stylistic array. The splintering divided genres into subgenres, and a fresh new vision would sometimes appear to shake up all past assumptions. The collective view of art in the 20th century is like a collage, assembled from input of ideas from anywhere they might be found. That's not to suggest that the art was eclectic. At least that was not the prevailing result. Often a unique idea was itself the goal of a work. A fissure is a crack that separates something into two, like a large rock separating from a cliff, or a crevasse in a glacier. As the two things become farther apart, they behave more and more independently. The two parts become increasingly different, even when the two things are made of the same stuff. The Atlantic Ocean is a big fissure, separating the continents. Geologically similar, but now different in climate, customs, and cultures. There are societal rifts, and many fissures in religion. Permanent divisions occur in families, politics, biology, culture, and the arts. I have more than once proclaimed to people that all music is all the same thing, and I have meant it wholeheartedly. The comment usually surfaces as a defensive statement when someone wants to venture into the minefield of one musical style, one composer, or music from a certain period as being of greater quality than another. I feel that great music is found across the full spectrum. Even though the range of language is vast and contrasting, all music is actually made of the same stuff. It has been dividing, multiplying, and evolving for a long, long time, like life itself. As we explore the rifts and fissures in art and music of the 20th century, we are temporarily going to plant ourselves mostly in the United States. In part, this can be valid because the wars that were occurring in Europe and Asia continued to bring important artists from those places across the oceans to the New World. Also, the cultural mix of America's melting pot was especially colorful, throwing surprising inspirations onto the canvas. Concentrating on North America, however, is not meant to dismiss the many important contributions by artists and composers elsewhere. We'll try to capture some of their names too as we go along. An iconoclast is someone who rejects traditions and beliefs, thereby creating fissures on purpose. Most iconoclastic composers were interested in completely rethinking music, or in imagining a music that pushed at the extreme edges of acceptance. This was the foundation for the avant-garde, a French term that could translate as the new front, or the vanguard, or the cutting edge. The idea was always to push boundaries and to ambitiously invent the new. We'll look at 4 composers within the realm of concert music, each with unique goals, and each had developed a strong following. Milton Babbitt would have seen himself as a contributor to the new trends of modernism. He was a professor at Princeton, Juilliard, and worked with the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center. He was also a noted mathematician. He adapted the serialism of Schoenberg, sometimes extending it to all parameters, note values, dynamics, articulation, as well as pitch, all serialized to create a music that was ultimately controlled, but was also freed from traditional constraints of harmony and melody. His carefully crafted works of gesture and design are beautiful creations, the result of a highly innovative and scientific mind driven by a fascination in processes and techniques. His 3 compositions for piano, written in 1947, is an example of total serialism. But knowing that the music has a high level of mathematical construction should not get in the way of our hearing. Serialism is a means to an end. Music is the result. Lou Harrison was born on the west coast of the U.S. and lived much of his life in California. He worked with and was influenced by Schoenberg, Henryk, Charles Ives, and others, while exploring his own interests in modern musical trends. Many California composers, being located far from the East Coast's influx of Europeanism, were more inspired by Asian influences. From early on, he was intrigued by the Javanese gamelan, the gongs, the tuning, and the distinctive timbres. His music began to change increasingly away from European models and more to the music of Indonesia, China, and Japan. Labrynth of 1941 is one such work. Written for a large percussion ensemble, gamelan gongs are included among an assortment of metallic, wood, and membrane percussion, both standard and unusual. Harry Partch took a great fascination in tuning, realizing that equal temperament, that gives us our standard 12 pitches, is full of compromise. Instead, he divided the octave into 43 unequal parts derived from acoustical realities, and then had to modify and create instruments in order to compose and perform his music. Of course, we know that microtonality isn't new. Many world cultures embrace a variety of tunings, and the voice, trombone, and fretless strings like the violin and cello do microtones easily as part of expressive performance. Natural pitch inflection is often microtonal. But Partch took just intonation to extreme application, and performing his works, especially his larger-scale theatrical pieces, requires the dedication of performers who have developed the skills to play his custom-built instruments. Partch often drew dramatic inspiration from classic models like Greek theater and from Japanese No and Kabuki theater. Here is a scene from his 1965-1966 play, Delusion of the Fury. The instruments are on stage as part of the set. Act 2 of Delusion of the Fury is based on an Ethiopian folk tale, a fable of futile anger resulting from silly misunderstandings. In this scene, an arrest and trial are occurring before the myopic judge, who is just as confused as everyone else. And finally, John Cage. In his famous piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, in which not a single note is played, one can say that he showed us that silence is as much part of music as is sound. He also proved that if there is a defined beginning and a defined end, anything that happens in between is perceived as musical form. But even those interesting conclusions may go well beyond his intent. As he said himself, "My purpose is to eliminate purpose." Cage saw no value in staying within the constraints of musical legacy. As such, he may have been the opposite of the modern composer, if being modern had to do with responding to legacy. You might say he was trying to be anti-modern, to steer away from musical evolution, and to rebuild from scratch. He may eventually be remembered for his philosophy more than for his compositions. But his ideas generated some fascinating music. He is well known for his pieces for prepared piano, for which he inserted all sorts of screws, bolts, and other items between the strings. As you might imagine, piano technicians weren't keen on such a process, but if carefully done, many believe it can be harmless to the instrument. And the result is full of percussive color, achievable in no other way. But you wouldn't be the first to observe that some of the sounds are reminiscent of a gamelan. Twentieth century New York City had developed into an important hub of artistic activity. and central and northern Manhattan, known as Uptown, was home to the pillars of the classical mainstream like Columbia, Lincoln Center, and Carnegie Hall. Downtown was different. At the bottom of Manhattan, one finds Soho, Greenwich Village, and New York University. Downtown, you would find many jazz clubs and music making emanating from the Soho lofts. In the late 1970s, when people downtown first heard Philip Glass's new innovations in minimalism, it created a remarkable positive reaction. This music was vibrant, rhythmic, and sweet in the ear. Composers like Philip Glass, Steve Reich, and John Adams became classified as minimalists, meaning that they favored a music that had a much slower pace of change and was pared down to just a few musical elements. Each of these composers has works in his output that qualify as a minimalist, but none of them have spent his career staying within such a limiting label. It is difficult to come up with a brief sample of minimalism, because part of its effect is the stretching of time. Reich's Music for 18 Musicians from 1976 is nearly an hour in length. I will have to fade it out after a few minutes. With the explosion of diverse musical styles that occurred in the 20th century, for the first time in history, audiences and critics began to think in terms of high art and low art. People talked about music being divided by good and bad, schooled and unschooled, uptown and downtown, sophisticated and unsophisticated, non-commercial and commercial, and serious versus popular. When people referred to high art, they were referring to a cultural core, as defined from their perspective. When they spoke of low art, they were definitely being judgmental, and they were generally referring to all kinds of pop music and dance music. The perception of good and bad was perpetuated by even the artists, many who felt that their work was of high art status and generally underappreciated. Some might feel that doing serious art might not pay the bills, but artistic integrity was important. In fact, if an artist made money from the art, the credibility of the art could be in question. The ultimate insult for an artist would be to be labeled a sellout. Of course, this has little to do with the value of the work. In effect, such judgment is self-limiting and illogical. The rift between high and low, and between non-commercial and commercial, contributed to a resistance by many of accepting jazz, rock, and rap as art, even though these musicians could be just as involved in artistic goals and avant-garde ideals. To some, these musical styles just seemed artistically irrelevant, and it took a long time for a public consensus to develop, allowing a larger umbrella to cover the concept of art. As the umbrella grew, modernism as a movement began to lose favor to what is sometimes called postmodernism, for lack of a better term. Many critics consider the minimalists of the late 70s to be postmodernists, and some would place John Cage there as well. By the end of the 20th century, the modern era had been largely left behind. The world wars were more distant, and the angst of the Cold War had ended. The cultural divisions of high versus low and serious versus popular lost meaning for most people, as audiences and scholars increasingly found value in all of it. Replacing the old arguments are new ones, such as notions that the European cultural pillars are elitist. Attempts at class division are always judgmental, self-limiting, and illogical. I'm tempted to proclaim again that all music is from the same stuff, and there is greatness throughout the genres. We should not coarsely dismiss any of it. When the Iron Curtain fell in the late 1980s, Russian and Eastern European composers who had been working as modernists for years suddenly had an opportunity to reach new audiences. For people who were becoming aware of their music for the first time, it had compelling mystery and possessed profound intensity. Over decades, their musical language had been influenced by Stalinist judgment and censoring, and by the traumas of war, conflict, and oppression. With its sad beauty and reverent humanity, it grabbed the listener's attention, much as had American minimalism 10 years earlier. Estonia's Arvo Pärt became the most frequently performed living composer at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. And Poland's Henryk Górecki came to international awareness with his 1992 recording of his Third Symphony, which has sold more than 1 million copies, far exceeding expectations for a symphonic recording by a living composer. We will end this episode with the second movement from Górecki's Third Symphony. The text is from a prayer to the Virgin Mary, inscribed on a prisoner's cell wall in Zakopane, Poland.